Everything is looking up for Africa. The once dark continent is now increasingly being viewed as the new frontier of economic opportunities. A new oil boom has just added to Africa's growing importance in the global economic marketplace. But this seemingly rosy picture has a very negative flip side, one that casts Africa as a continent endowed with immense resources, but one that is also steeped in poverty. It is a historical issue that must be addressed now by Africa. But the question is, how? Well, joining us in this discussion from Johannesburg is Professor Shadrack Guto of the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at the University of South Africa. And in studio here with me is Professor Israel Kodiaga, the Director of the African Center for International Studies, joining us here in the studio. But first, before we begin discussions, let's take a glimpse at Africa's oil and natural gas reservoirs.
Energy is an indispensable input for economic growth and social development. Two-thirds of global energy requirements are met with oil and gas supplies, a joint study by the African Development Bank and the African Union reveals. The study forecasts an important role for Africa in this sector, positing that the continent has considerable oil and gas resources that can help accelerate economic growth if used strategically.
We are revising our Petroleum Exploration Act to bring it into line with the new constitution. And the emphasis in the new constitution is really the sharing of the resource so that the host community is not marginalized.
Furthermore, Africa is the only continent in the world with frequent and substantive new findings of oil and gas. In another report by global audit firm Ernst & Young released last month, Africa has been cited as holding large reservoirs of natural gas. The report says the resource can be a primary driver of economic growth and broader social development, as well as a major spur for local employment growth and infrastructure development in Africa. But much still needs to be done to ensure the billions of dollars earned from these resources trickle down to the citizenry. To this end, African governments and regional NGOs have a critical role to play. The African Development Bank, together with the African Union, are scaling up efforts geared towards helping African governments design and implement strategies that would ensure optimal utilization of oil and gas resources to accelerate growth and development on the continent. This could herald a new era of transparency, accountability, and good governance, and end years of politics of state patronage, instability, and extreme deprivation that has been linked to this important resource in Africa.
Indeed. New prospects, new potential. First, Professor Guto in Johannesburg, with economies in the West still largely in desperate situations, there are new discoveries of natural resources here in several African countries, and this has brought new potential for the continent. The question is, though, will these windfalls be a blessing for the continent or a political and economic curse, do you think?
I believe that the resources are abundant in Africa, and they have been from time immemorial. We went through a period of plunder during the colonial period. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a good work in that respect. After independence, of course, Africa entered a period where it was not left alone. There was the neo-colonial paradigm replaced colonialism, and plunder continued, with, of course, the collaboration of a few elite in Africa that left the majority of African people in poverty.
Africa's leaders, do you think they will continue, though, to fail their people with this new potential?
I think what is critical in Africa at the moment is the citizens waking up and saying the resources of the countries belong to the people. The people have sovereignty over their resources and not just a few leaders. And we have seen various uprisings in some parts of Africa, northern part of Africa. We are seeing unrest in many of the countries in other parts of Africa where the citizens are saying, we want development, we want industrialization, We want Africa connectivity into Africa, trade, infrastructure development. Of course, we shall welcome foreign investment, but we should not do so under the same paradigm as has happened since most of the countries became independent. We can do it.
All right, Professor Kodiaga.
Thank you very much. The question of the discovery of oil, vast oil resources, is it a curse or a blessing? The issue here is that the discovery itself is a blessing, but the utilization is where the curse is found. And the curse is found within the gamuts of the agreements that are arrived at the point when we are having these foreign investing companies coming into Africa. And don't forget, like Professor has just well articulated, that all these things have a history, and they can go back to the Industrial Revolution, come to colonization, the 1884-85 Berlin West African Conference, where half a dozen European nations sat and decided on spheres of influence. And don't forget, they already brought forward concessionaire companies like the British South African company of Cecil Rhodes. We had William Mackinnon in East Africa. We had George Goldie the other side of West Africa, and were spread all over. So in essence, it is the same old game being played differently, but the intentions and the purposes are still the same.
But that's the question, though. That is the issue that African countries seem to still be talking about historical issues. I mean, this is a new era.
Yes, this is a new era, but the game, the rules of the game remain the same. If we talk about oil in particular, don't forget that the issue of oil has more to do with some agreement which was entered between America and the oil-producing companies, OPEC, in the early 70s. And this was a simple agreement that said that all the oils produced will be purchased using the dollar. That is the so-called petrodollar. So, by extension, it gave America authority or opportunity to go and print several pieces of paper, keep them somewhere, you produce oil, and for you to have somebody buy your oil, that person must buy it against the dollar. What does it mean? One, you must trade with America in one way or the other to get the dollar. And if you cannot trade with America in one way or the other to get the dollar, then you must buy the dollar in the open market. Nations that have tried to go against the so-called the petrodollar are the ones who now are called the axis of evil. So you'll find Venezuela there, you'll find Iraq there, you'll find Korea there, and even Iran.
All right, I'll just get Professor Guto's statement on that. Is it a new era for Africa, but the same old practices exist?
Well, there are books now being written about a new scramble for Africa. That is the new adage in the public domain and discourse. But Africa should not allow itself to be looted continuously. And this is where I'm indicating that the citizens ought to ask for transparency in terms of agreements that are being concluded by governments and so on, so that they are examined. Africa has intellectual capital, technical capacity to be able to assess every investment. I would urge that most of the investment agreement must be made transparent. We can't be talking on the one hand that we want good governance, accountable governments, and so on. On the other hand, we allow the leaders to engage by signing agreements that are just looting the country. So it is quite critical.
You talk about a new scramble for Africa here, and various Western powers have talked about this. Hillary Clinton, U.S. Secretary of State, was in Africa recently. Here is what she had to say on that matter.
The days of having outsiders come and extract the wealth of Africa for themselves, leaving nothing or very little behind, should be over in the 21st century.
Western countries are talking about Africa's resources being spirited out of the continent. What is the new context? Is that really a concern?
In fact, the biggest problem that we have is not the absence of resources, it is the utilization. Africa is not poor, but the people are. Like Professor has just alluded to very rightly, is that we are having weak governance structures. That is the first problem. Two, when these agreements are signed, they are not made in the open. So the people are not aware of the details of the agreements. Thirdly, most of these companies have no concern of the populace around the areas, like in the case of Nigeria, which we are talking about. You find Nigeria produces 2 million barrels of oil per day, which is 60% of what Iran produces, and a quarter of what Saudi Arabia produces. But Nigeria still is amongst the poorest nations in the world, with over 70% of the population living below $1. Look at that contrast. How come they have the largest producer of oil, and they are in fact the 4th largest exporter of oil to America?
So why this disparity, though?
This disparity is as a result of what we would call the oil diplomacy. Today, you find there are restive groups in Nigeria. We have this Boko Haram, who are talking about seceding and moving the north, and then the Christian South would only be too happy to secede also, to stay away from to leave their Muslim brothers, to move to the north, and they remain to the south. What does that mean? It means during that turmoil, during that instability, the Western multinationals make a kill. So they actually instigate these conflicts. They instigate balkanization with the aim of profiting. So whatever Hillary Clinton is saying on telly, that is just for purposes of window dressing. But we do know that America has a hand in many of these conflicts. Look at DRC.
All right. We'll get Professor Guto's sentiment on that. Your take, Professor.
Well, I think it is very important for Africa not to listen to lectures from the West. Our underdevelopment has been because we have had a North-South relation, and therefore economically the West has been milking Africa. And for the West to begin to lecture to us of things that we know because we are suffering, I think we should just say, no, thank you. We know what is right for Africa. But the whole question of Africa being seen now to be continuously exploited is a reality, and it is up to us to say no, no, no.
All right, Professor.
Yes, I could not agree more. The point is Africans must take their destiny into their own hands. Look at the BRICS relationship that Africa is having with Brazil, Russia, India, and China. China is actually emerging as the leading player. And so far, the way China does its game, one, China is more creative. Two, China would even go and start up businesses in the middle of nowhere where others fear going. And of course, they're also coming with a muscle, financial muscle. And the only way to know whether a given industry, whether it is oil, whether it is in gold, whether it is copper, or whichever mineral we are talking about, the only way to know that this particular venture is benefiting the populace, you look at the health programs. Do we have health programs that actually show that the people are taken care of? Two, look at infrastructure. And thirdly, look at education.
When you look at it, though, both of you have talked about new players coming in during Africa's oil boom. Do you feel, though, that African countries now have the leeway to sign proper trade agreements with the new incoming players?
The answer to that is yes and no. Africa has always had the leeway to do that. But no, because of weak governance structures. As long as we have weak governance structures, as long as we have people within government who themselves are out to line their pockets with quick monies, then obviously the agreements will not benefit the population. Two, when we have China here, we have America here, we have, say, let's talk of BRICS, then we have the West and all of them. Then we can now say, now, present to us, give us your offer, and we will choose, and we will go to the best bidder. This is the way I look at it.
All right, Professor Guto, do you feel, though, that Africa has the leeway in trade negotiations this time around?
We do have the capacity. We do have African intellectuals and political economists, lawyers, and all sorts of capital working for global institutions like the World Bank and so on. And we can utilize them. We have many within Africa itself, and we need our governments to use them rather than get so-called advisors from the very people who want to exploit our resources and so on. So we must utilize our intellectual capital. But importantly, also the North and elsewhere in the world must accept that they have been the ones keeping stolen wealth by our leaders. We regard many of the leaders in Africa as having been corrupt, and some are still corrupt. But where do they hide those resources? They are in the banks, financial institutions, real estate in the North. And why is the North keeping stolen wealth of the people?
All right, Professor Kodiaga, we'll return to this discussion in a moment. Professor Guto in Johannesburg, thank you for staying with us. We will continue with this discussion in a moment.
We have a chance to steer things in the right direction. We, of course, should deal with both. We should deal with China, the emerging countries, and the West. But we should also make sure that we have the right regulatory systems that protect our interest. We should also make sure that whatever arrangements we enter into is mutually beneficial.
Welcome back to the program. So how can Africa harness her potential for the benefit of the citizenry? And what best practices and lessons are there for Africa to learn from? Professor Guto in Johannesburg. Today we are talking about all but 5 of Africa's 54 countries are either producing or looking for oil. Are we seeing, though, that these countries are putting in place the institutions, the policies and the laws that will be needed to ensure that the resource trickles down to the citizens?
Not at the level that we would like to see. Many talk about it and have various plans, but I think the test is in really the doing, not the talking and the writing and so on. So that is the first thing. The second, I believe, is that we need, first of all, to revise the old investment agreements so that we align them with the necessities of Africa in the 21st century. The new ones ought also to depart from the old paradigm and to be able to be developmental investments that, of course, are profitable to those who invest, but the profits, some of it must be plowed back so that we don't have capital flight all the time from Africa.
All right. Should countries like Kenya, Uganda, Mozambique, Ghana be celebrating?
The answer to that is no, because the first danger is chaos that are instigated. Basically, when a country is going to get oil, you'll find there will always be chaos. Or some mineral, there will always be chaos. And these chaos are usually instigated by the old players. So I agree with Professor that, one, we must have a paradigm shift. And therefore, as we plan to harness these resources, now we must be more smarter. We must be smarter to ensure that they do not bring around us gangs who are going to ensure that there is instability, and so that the oil or the new resources do not benefit the populace. But we have to right our wrongs, and some of the wrongs have been well articulated by Professor Guto. Corruption is one of them. Weak governance structures is another one. Issues about capital flight and other things are issues that must be addressed. And like our good Kofi Annan says, the agreements must be mutually beneficial so that posterity will judge us positively.
You talk about Africa's leadership being quite a bit of a problem across the continent, but of course we have seen some positive developments in countries like Ghana, in countries like Senegal, in countries like Malawi. Are there any positives at all?
Well, there are a lot of prospects. One thing which was symbolic but very important is when the new leader in Malawi took over, what did she do? She cut her salary and benefits and indicated that she cannot be lauding and swimming in wealth when her own people are not. That is a leader that is giving an example to all the others who surround themselves with a whole lot of bodyguards as if they fear their own citizens and so on, waste a lot of resources and do not plow this into developmental issues.
All right, various African leaders have talked continuously about the new leadership across the continent and a new way of doing business on the continent. Let's listen in on what President Johnson Sirleaf has to say.
I think that's going to be our greatest challenge, that we make sure we continue our diversification effort, that we don't concentrate on oil, that we make sure it's not a curse and we use it not only for current generation, but we come up with mechanisms and approaches that will secure its use and its benefit for future generation. I think many African countries are conscious of what happened in the past and are going to use best practices from all around the world to ensure that this resource is used for the good of the people and for the development of our continent.
Professor Kodiaga, a lot has been talked about expertise, best practices, but one of the issues that has been hampering the growth of Africa's development has been this question of technology. Do we feel now, though, that enough technology transfer has been undertaken over the past years to enable Africa's probably process her own raw materials?
When you talk about technology transfer, essentially what we look at here is not a question of begging or going to pick Western technology and extrapolating it onto the African soil. The point is we must deal with the categorical imperative. Let us look at what is relevant and we use it. And when we are talking about technological transfer, we also talk about counter-penetration technologically. We are not saying that Africa must be a dependent and a consumer of Western technology. We must also counter-penetrate. And you know as well as I do that there are indeed quite a lot of advancements which have been made which we can actually turn productively. The point is, do we have the willingness to move to that level? And I think, Madam Sirleaf Johnson has articulated, that there's a new wave, there's a new mode of thinking, of doing things better. I want to see that in the African Union, because I'm one person who feels very much that the African Union has been in slumber for a very long time, since the date of its birth in 1999 in the waters of Sirte. Why am I saying this? When we're having the elections of the chairmanship of the African Union, there are all sorts of things, and that could tell you that Africa was not ready for a transformation. There are those who are very comfortable with the status quo, and in fact, it took the grace of God, resilience, and some kind of cunning genius to have Madam Dlamini Zuma assume the chair, and we do know that she has the capacity to now transform that body.
So how then are you expecting that transformation to take place? That
transformation is gradual, and in many ways, I would talk about the citizenry demanding their rights, which in essence is actually prescribing revolution, but it's a revolution in the constitutional sense, the same way that Kenya went through a revolution constitutionally. So it is the more that the African populace demand for better governance, the more the African populace demand for services, the more the better the African populace demand for accountability from their leadership, the more that the leadership will wake up to the reality that they must transform this continent.
All right, Professor Guto?
I would just like to say that Africa, we need to set new goalposts. Where we are going. First of all, oil-producing countries must refine the oil, must export oil products and not just crude oil, as has been the case so far. Countries like Cameroon should actually be exporting chocolate rather than just cocoa, and the list goes on. South Africa, that is abundant, there's abundant minerals of all types, and Botswana and so on. Beneficiation should take place in Africa, and that is industrialization, and create employment, create greater wealth and so on, so that when we trade with the world, we add value to what we trade. This is how we ought to be discussing with each other, have a dialogue among us as citizens of Africa, but also call the leaders to come and listen to what the people are saying. They just can't lead the way they have done before, where they are simply being agents of neocolonialism on the continent. The people are tired of that.
All right, I see you're agreeing there,
yes.
Professor Kodiaga.
Just a little more on that. We may also take best practice examples from elsewhere. And what is coming to mind now are Japan and China, Korea. We may need to look at how these countries have managed to actually join the club and be a major threat to the powers that be. When you look at Japan, there was a phase of self-imposed isolation where they took Western technology, but they took it and acculturated it in their culture. So they took the Western technology, but did not take Western way of life. Look at China. China took a time when they went back to the home industries, domestic industry, and used it actually to move the country to the next level. Then they came to the world when they were prepared. Africa needs to go back to what Professor Guto was talking about. Let us trade with each other.
All right, we're winding up in a moment, but briefly and very briefly, the inherent risks for the new oil economies, can they be mitigated?
The inherent risks in the oil industry can be very, very well mitigated. And the first thing that can be done is ensuring that all agreements that are entered with oil mining companies or the foreign companies that are coming to explore oil enter transparent agreements which are distinct, clear, and are on the table for everyone to see, so that all of us are able to look at that agreement and see whether it is symbiotic or not. Two, there must be clear programs as to how the proceeds from the oil are going to be used for the benefit of the people. And when we are saying the people, we are not talking about the small population around the oil mining area. Neither are we talking about the small population, the cohort group of the people in power. We are talking about the country.
All right, Professor Guto, you have the final word on this. What do you see as the inherent risks for the new oil economies, and can they be addressed?
They can be addressed. First of all, approach extracting oil from the point of view that they must be developmental. They must really be improved, and not just the crude oil going out, but we must also ensure that apart from making sure that we industrialize, we need to create greater free trade area, which is being talked about from Cairo to South Africa. We must be able to connect the north, east, south with the west, and so on. And all of this can be done through really beneficial infrastructural development that we can go into partnerships, but through new contracts, new paradigms that are transparent and very clear.
All right, Professor Israel Kodiaga, Director of the Center for International Studies, thank you very much for being here on Talk Africa. And Professor Shadrack Guto from the Center for African Renaissance at the University of South Africa, joining us from Johannesburg. I thank you very much for being here on Talk Africa. This has been Talk Africa for today. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Bye-bye.